Joining me now for more on this topic is Timothy Canova. He is professor of international economic law at Chapman University. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, before we get into kind of the economic nitty-gritty, I just am curious, often the debate in this country is framed as Republicans versus Democrats, but do you think that is becoming less important than the divide between the haves and the have-nots in the United States?
I think that is an interesting way to look at it. There is a remarkable amount of degree of consensus between Republican and Democratic elected officials. One wouldn't know it by hearing the disagreements, let's say, on budget issues. But the recent budget disputes that almost shut down the federal government were over $139 billion in cuts. In a budget that's $3 to $4 trillion a year, it's actually not a huge difference between the two parties, and they found consensus, as it were. I think some of the polls that you've already cited do suggest that there is a big disconnect between the political classes in the United States and the average American who has not done well, both during the recession and this recovery. And
joblessness is one thing you could point to. The unemployment rate is 9.1% for Americans. Meanwhile, you see corporations that post record profits. You see CEO pay go up astronomically. And then you see a case like we just saw in that story where Americans that are tenants are unable to get their landlord to get rid of bed bugs because their landlord is a bank-owned property that is saying it's not our responsibility. So kind of again, you see the banks kind of get a free pass and just average Americans get hurt by this. So my question to you is, who has been helped by the government more in the recession? Has it been the haves with the bailouts of Wall Street, for example, or the have-nots? Because, you could argue on the other hand of that is that, AIG, for example, held pensions that, average Americans would have lost entirely if that wasn't bailed out. So who do you think really has been rescued more, the haves or the have-nots?
The haves by far and away. The Federal Reserve has thrown several $1 trillion at the largest financial institutions in this country through low-interest loans, but also through outright purchases of financial assets from these large financial institutions. And then, of course, there's the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which is the federal government's, the Treasury Department's response to the financial crisis. And you look at all the stimulus for Main Street combined, and it's really just a small fraction of the kind of support that Wall Street has gotten throughout this crisis. We're looking at the most top-heavy distribution of wealth and income since before the 1920s, perhaps since the Gilded Age of the 1890s. And most Americans are feeling this pinch. You mentioned the official unemployment rate is 9.1%. The Labor Department also measures a wider unemployment and underemployment situation, which brings in part-time workers who would like to get full-time work with benefits and are not able to. It brings in discouraged workers who have been unemployed for a long time and have given up looking for jobs. When you look at the wider unemployment and underemployment figures, we're talking about 1 out of 5 Americans are in that classification. And those who haven't lost their jobs, of course, are certainly worried that they could be losing their jobs with just another slowdown in the economy. So that leads.
So then my question for you is it, we heard President Obama's economic counsel say that it is the private sector's job now to take over and create jobs. Do you buy that? Is that disingenuous to say when the United States government bailed out banks, poured money into quantitative easing, which essentially has stayed with banks? Do you buy that?
No, and certainly there's a degree of hypocrisy that most Americans will feel in their gut that the federal government has come to the rescue for the banks. But when it comes to creating jobs, the federal government's position at this point is that all it can do is give tax incentives for business to hire, but that the government will not take the lead in creating public jobs programs.
What do you think the government can do?
Well, I think we should be looking at what the government did during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. The 1930s was a decade where we had economic growth, but it just wasn't fast enough to soak up the huge numbers of unemployed Americans. And during that decade, the federal government had a civilian conservation corps, which employed several million young Americans to clear underbrush in the nation's parks and forests. They had a Works Projects Administration, which, again, employed millions of adult Americans, including Ronald Reagan's father. And the Work Projects Administration built roads and bridges and hospitals and airports, LaGuardia Airport in New York, the Triborough Bridge. And this generation, really ever since Ronald Reagan was president, there's been this bipartisan consensus that the federal government should not have any public jobs programs. And I don't think it's just hypocrisy. I think it's foolish and counterproductive to the efficiency of a private sector economy.
And you certainly hear a lot of talk about the private sector, but you don't see the political will for anything even remotely looking like what you're talking about that you say could be a solution. I want to thank you, though, for telling us about it here on RT. That was Timothy Canova, professor of international economic law at Chapman University.